Jujutsu Kaisen is unbelievably popular. If you watch anime or read manga at all, or maybe even if you don't, you've definitely at least heard of this show. The story has reached a level of popularity that even non-watchers might be able to recognize a character or two from it, because the anime and the manga are literally plastered everywhere, and for good reason too. I loved the anime, it was amazing in every sense of the word, but I didn't really have any desire to read the manga at all. I've always been a guy who prefers watching an anime over reading this manga, I just enjoy it more. But more recently, after being exposed to more manga, that thinking has kinda changed. Rather than thinking that all anime are better than its manga counterpart, it now depends on the type of anime for me. If the show is pretty much all action like Baki or Demon Slayer, I'll probably just stick with the anime and enjoy the animation and fights in that way. But if it's an anime with a bit more depth to the story, I'll probably gravitate to just reading the manga instead of waiting it out for a year or more to continue the story with the next season. Basically, if the show's main draw for me is just this cool animation, then it does make sense for me to continue watching it, to experience more of that cool animation that the manga obviously can't provide. Which takes me to season 1 of Jujutsu Kaisen. Don't get me wrong, it was pretty good. The non-stop action was amazing and the animation was breathtaking at points. Sure, it was simple, but there wasn't anything wrong with that because it was executed so well that I even made my first ever YouTube video praising how well MAPPA had done with the show. But that's the thing, I was praising how well MAPPA had done, or in other words, the studio that animated the show. The truth is, that was the main draw of Jujutsu Kaisen for me, and probably the main draw for the majority of other people too. Sure, there were some other things like some cool characters and an interesting concept, but really the entire show just felt like an excuse to display some of the coolest sequences the studio could put together. It was a pretty simple anime without much depth, and so it fell into the category of anime I mentioned earlier. Why would I read the manga when the main reason I enjoyed the show so much was the animation? And then season 2 happened. Literally everything I've said about Jujutsu Kaisen to this point was just thrown out the window. Season 2 was unbelievable and it completely subverted my expectations when it came to the show. I don't even know where to start. Even before the arc that I'm sure you guys want to hear about, we get a Gojo flashback that really changed my perception of the entire show. As I said, my expectations going into the season was more of the same, with maybe a little more character development and even cleaner animation, much like the route Demon Slayer took. But this was so different. The first part of season 2 was the hidden inventory arc. We get introduced to Toji, someone we will later find out is one of the most interesting characters in the series. We dive into Suguru Geto and Satoru Gojo's motivations and past. 5 episodes of pure greatness. I enjoyed it so much, and it really caught me by surprise that I was experiencing such a deep level of love for a show I had originally labeled simple. I could really go on forever about this 5 episode stretch, but the important thing is the message that it gave me. This show has a lot more to offer than just animation, and the Shibuya arc multiplied that feeling to the 1000th degree. Again, don't get me wrong, the animation and fighting in both arcs are unbelievable, and I would go as far as to say is significantly better than season 1 even in the visual department. But there was just so much more as well. Ryoma and Sukuna took center stage and flourished as a merciless villain who just emanates a certain powerful energy anytime he appears on the screen, battling with Jogo and Mahoraga while decimating Shibuya in the process. Mahito showed his true colors with all its twisted glory in his brawl with Todo and Yuji, a fight that increased my estimation of all 3 of these characters greatly. Nobara was explored more before her presumed death. Nanami unfortunately died too, finally releasing himself from the stress he put his mind under every single day for the sake of the Jujutsu Kaisen world, and still with his last breath he propels his student forward, dying in the way that he lived. Toji comes back and finally has an interaction with his son Megumi. Gojo was sealed too, completely stripping away the safety net that the good side usually have and really upping the stakes and the fear factor involved in this arc, without this ever-present protection blanket around. There are countless other things that happen in this arc too, and even though most of these moments were fights just like the first season, there was a key difference between these fights and the ones in season 1. substance. The fights actually meant something. I cared about the outcomes of every single exchange because there was genuine meaning behind it, and consequences that occurred because of it. In season 1, it felt like the story was just an excuse for the characters to constantly fight curses while hyping up Gojo and Sukuna in the process. But in season 2, the fights and writing go hand in hand to provide the best experience possible. When there are stakes and such detailed characters fighting, it just feels different. When Sukuna uses his domain expansion, we see the deaths of so many people and the carnage he has caused. There are real consequences to the insane fights he has with Joga and Mahoraga, and Itadori's face tells the entire story, and this arc only served to reinforce the message from earlier: I was wrong. Jujutsu Kaisen is not a simple story. It is not just blindly fighting curses over and over again with beautiful animation, and it is definitely not the type of anime I wouldn't read the manga for. Coupling this newfound feeling with the final episode's cliffhanger with Yuta, I decided I couldn't wait anymore and took a nosedive into the manga that has been taking over the world, Jujutsu Kaisen. My journey in this manga started with the introduction of this pretty cool looking misogynist, Naoya Zenin, as he meets up with some of the other Zenin clan members to discuss the next head of the clan, as their father, the previous head, had just died. But in a shocking turn of events, we actually find out that Toji came to an agreement with the Zenin clan that if Gojo was incapacitated or killed, Megumi would become the next head, enraging Naoya, who leaves on his path to actually kill Megumi and Sukuna's vessel Yuji. Before I even watched the hidden inventory arc in the anime, Toji's name was always being hyped up, and yeah, his fight with Gojo was amazing, but it kind of shocked me that he died within 5 episodes of his introduction. But whenever I asked manga readers why he was so many people's favourite character while only lasting 5 episodes, they all responded with the same thing: his impact. And in the very first chapter of the manga that I have read, this impact is put on full display as Toji's agreement with the Zenin clan sets us on our path for our first conflict, as Choso, Yuji, Naoya and Yuta clash in the first display of fighting in the Jujutsu Kaisen world that I have experienced in manga form. Before I get into that though, I want to talk about Yuji and his self-hating nature. We get a glimpse into how Yuji views himself as he reflects on Shibuya and the deaths that were caused by his own body, and he puts complete blame on himself. A sad but understandable way of viewing the massacre. Also, I can't wait for the time we get more information into Choso, as he's in a weird state for me. He's a really cool character, but I can't fully tell what side he's on. I mean, just an arc ago he was killing countless humans for convenience, but now after realizing Yuji is his brother, he seems different. Not just to Yuji, but in general. What's interesting to me will be how he deals with other humans now after accepting one of them as his brother. Will he still see these people as disposable, worthless objects, or will he take on Yuji's values and change his own? But anyway, we get into the first main fight in this mini arc, and it's really cool. To be honest, I'm relieved. Fights in manga have been a huge coin toss for me. Either I have to read a panel 10 times to understand what move a fighter has done, or the fights are done so well that I actually feel like the page is moving. And with this fight, it was definitely the latter. But the best part of it was definitely the entrance of Yuta, freezing all of the fighters at once. He literally entered the battlefield with so much aura that Yuji literally thought it was Gojo. That's almost a feat in itself. And Choso follows suit, immediately assuming from his presence alone that Yuta was similar to Gojo in that if they fought him, they would die. What a reintroduction for our old main character, and he chases our new one down before engaging with him in a fight, if we can even call it that. It was more Yuji running away as he threw in some creative moves here and there, and when he finally took the offensive, Rika stepped in, and the fight ended just as quickly as it started, with Yuta actually stabbing him straight through the chest. Even Sukuna is shocked as he realizes for a second that his vessel has actually been killed. And I was shocked too. Were we going back to JJK 0 with Yuta as the main character or something? But everything started to make sense when I came out of my state of shock and scrolled down to see the next page and saw Sukuna's expression change to a smile. And I was worried even more. Did he remember something? Does he take control of Yuji's body if he dies? That kinda goes against against everything we've learned so far and it doesn't really make sense. Were there specific conditions that meant that Sukuna could survive even if Yuji were to be killed? This chapter left me with so many questions that were answered the moment I turned the page and Yuji woke up. But before all of that, we find out that Choso was right. Yuji's own mother was the same man that had birthed Choso and the other curses, the man or woman with the scar on their forehead, the brain guy that we met in Shibuya, who made the questionable and confusing decision of being Yuji's mother as opposed to being his father. Like, I really didn't understand that at all. Surely it's easier to just not go through pregnancy and childbirth yourself? But anyways, speaking of Choso, we learn a little more about him in his fight with Naoya. Although my questions on his morality haven't really been answered yet, this fight reinforced the idea that he is only motivated by his brothers and nothing else. But yeah, Yuji wakes up to Yuta's relief as he explains that he entered a binding vow to kill Yuji in order to fake his death and protect him, but he used reverse curse technique to instantly heal him the moment his heart stopped. The higher ups show their true nature again, pouncing on the chance to execute Itadori the moment Gojo is incapacitated, and I can't say I'm surprised. They will probably do the same thing to Yuta too if not for his overwhelming strength. But this final chapter of the arc also dives a little bit deeper into Yuji's mental state after Shibuya, showing us how deep the mental damage he has taken truly is. It's gotten to the point where he's so unsure as to whether or not he should live or die that he held back while fighting Yuta even with his life on the line. He sees himself as Sukuna because they are sharing the same body. From his perspective, it's almost like Sukuna is his alter ego rather than a separate entity that happens to be living within him. When he places blame on Sukuna, he places blame on himself too for hosting such a monster. In his eyes, it's not Sukuna that massacred those people, it's Yuji Itadori. This sort of idea kind of reminds me of the way the villagers in Naruto saw the main character. Although I barely watched Naruto, I can see the similarities between the two situations, except one seems more internal with Yuji himself feeling like he is Sukuna, while the other is external with people around Naruto blaming him for the Nine Tails tragedy. Megumi arrives to the scene and reminds Yuji what it means to be a Jujutsu sorcerer in this world. He tells him to stop thinking about himself and simply save people, which really shines a light on the harsh life of a Jujutsu sorcerer in this verse. The lack of humanity afforded to these sorcerers is one of the main factors that drove the likes of Suguru Geto to evil after all. But anyways, Megumi tells Yuji that Noritoshi Kamo has made plans to make a game, which his sister Sumiki is unfortunately involved in, the Culling Games. Yuta, Choso, Megumi and Yuji decide that they need to meet with the mysterious Tengen to get some answers. And when they arrive at Jujutsu High, they meet Yuki, Sumiko and Maki, who agree with their plan, and after some brotherly pathfinding from Choso, Tengen finally reveals themselves. Actually, before they meet up with Tengen, Yuji wonders why there are bloodstains on the path, the same place that Toji killed Riko all those years ago. And Sumiko reminds us that this is where everything started to become distorted. Again, Gege is clearly drilling into us the large impact that the short-lived villain had on the story, changing the reality that everyone lived in and showing that Gojo had the potential to be beaten just like anyone else, planting the seeds that would be active even 11 years after his death. But anyways, Tengen reveals that she has evolved due to Toji murdering Riko, and therefore she is now vulnerable to curse spirit manipulation from the man with the scar, who Tengen reveals to be a man named Kenjaku, who plans to merge humans with Tengen to force their evolution, with the Culling game serving as a ritual to begin this merging process. So basically he needs protection now since Kenjaku is coming after him, and he tells everyone that he will give them the answers they seek in return for 2 bodyguards. Yuki, who seems to have a past with Tengen, and Choso, who wants to be useful in any way to his brother, volunteer. And Tengen reveals the back of the prison realm, telling everyone that they need to find a Culling Games player called Angel in order to open it and finally free Gojo. So the unlikely team split up. Yuta will enter the Culling Games to find information, Yuji and Megumi will recruit Hakari, Maki will return to the Zenin clan to collect tools, and Choso and Yuki will remain with Tengen to protect him. Hakari is starting to excite me now. A man who Yuta said had strength that even rivaled his own is a huge claim that immediately gives me high hopes for the character. I mean, he's got to be ridiculously powerful if Yuta believes that recruiting him is worth delaying Yuji and Megumi from entering the Culling Games as soon as possible. And this is like the 3rd mention of Hakari so far. I remember back in the anime, Gojo mentioned Hakari alongside Yuta as the 2 sorcerers he believed could match match him in strength one day, and even when he tells Yuta to protect the Jujutsu High students, he removes Hakari from that list, as he believes he will be fine on his own, making me pretty excited to meet the man backed by the two strongest sorcerers of the modern day. Toji is mentioned here yet again as a person who set everything in motion. I mean, Gege is literally in love with this guy, and his existence as a person free of cursed energy is sort of a contradiction that makes no sense in the Jujutsu Kaisen world. And in Tengen's own words, it destroyed their destinies, again highlighting the importance of Toji and Geto in Kenjaku's plan. We get a perspective shift into the life of Principal Yaga, who was put up for execution by the higher-ups to pressure him into revealing how he is able to make self-sufficient cursed corpses. An insane power if used to make an army, for example, which is exactly why Yaga has kept it a secret the whole time. For a second I wondered why the higher-ups weren't pressuring him before for this information, but then I remembered Gojo is sealed. It's easy to forget just how many people are protected from just one man being present, and the fallout of his sealing has for that reason been catastrophic for people targeted by the higher ups, with Yaga himself being the latest victim. We learn a bit more about him before he is ultimately killed by his fellow principal, who is being ordered by another sorcerer, and as he is dying he reveals how to make self-sufficient cursed corpses. When Gakunaji asks him why he waited until he was dying to reveal it, he told him he wanted to give him this information as a curse before he finally passes on. Panda comes immediately after this, and instead of attacking the man that murdered his father, he just starts crying and mourns his death in a very touching moment that was completely ruined for me by Twitter. I hate Twitter because even though this was a moment I'm sure I would have loved, I couldn't help but laugh the moment I saw this panel. But luckily this was the only thing that was really ruined for me in the manga so far, thanks to muted words. But anyway, shifting back to one of my favorite characters in the story, Maki, as her mother and father have a literal competition to see who can be the worst parent. Maki's father Ogi cuts Maki down and tosses her into a room with curses along with Mai, crying as he does so, not because he cared about them at all, but because he blames their existence as weak sorcerers for him not being able to be the head of the clan, definitely winning that bad parent competition I was talking about a second ago. Mai then sacrifices her life to create a sword and takes Maki's remaining cursed energy with her, giving Maki a heavenly restricted body and leaving her with one more mission before she dies: destroy everything. With that, the Zenin family is annihilated. Her father, Naoya, and everybody else in between are all massacred, and the Zenin clan is destroyed. Wow, what a stretch. The action in this manga is just portrayed so well, it literally feels like the page is moving and the fights are animated. Everything just makes sense, and the fight flows from panel to panel effortlessly. I only really have to read over everything once to understand what is going on, and if Maki wasn't already one of my favorite characters before, she definitely is now with what was probably my favorite stretch so far. Talking about characters, we finally get to meet another one in Kinji Hakari, and he is everything I wanted him to be. After finally convincing him and Kirara that Gojo was indeed sealed, and after some convincing in the form of letting him punch Yuji repeatedly and a under the table deal with Megumi, we finally managed to win Hakari and Kirara over. A really interesting part about this scene was Yuji's cog mentality. As we know, he's been battling his emotions throughout the entirety of Shibuya, and his lack of self-worth and importance is a result of this. In a way, being just another cog in a much larger system absolves a lot of the guilt Yuji has been feeling over the Shibuya incident, so maybe that's a reason why he is subconsciously treating himself in this way. I don't think Yuji is the type to consciously absolve himself of blame and would instead go the exact opposite route and place the blame on himself completely. But maybe subconsciously, this kind of thinking where he depersonalizes himself is the only way for him to keep moving forward, as we can see him adopt this kind of thinking previously too. Even Megumi dehumanizes sorcerers, and while it is of course not a positive thing to see yourself as less than human, perhaps it's a way of sorcerers to protect themselves from the everyday guilt they feel from being unable to save everyone. But with that, we are finally able to move on to the arc that the previous two have been leading up to, the Culling Games. This arc was everything I wanted it to be. I think it's fair to say that hype and build up was warranted because what an amazing arc it was. The arc starts with the team splitting up to find the two high value players and take their points. Yuji and Megumi will find Higuruma while Hakari and Panda will find Kashimo. And after a little fight between Yuji and a random couple, we arrive at the first major talking point in this arc: Itadori versus Hiromi Higuruma. Higuruma is easily the quickest I've loved a character in Jujutsu Kaisen so far. His domain expansion extermination and curse techniques are really interesting, but what really shines is the depth of his character. A troubled genius, someone who in the court of law struggles with the idea of bias and its effects, someone who, as he puts it, makes it a point to always keep his eyes open, even when common sense is telling him to close them. A great example is the case that his backstory is based on. The accused murderer that he is defending has such a ridiculous story that common sense would lead you to immediately toss it aside as an obvious lie, but Higuruma keeps his eyes open and looks for any possibility of it being true, giving the defendant a fair chance at innocence rather than simply deciding not to take the case on due to what seemed like an obvious lie. And this kind of defines his character, or at least what I've seen so far. Even in this broken state that he's in after finally cracking due to the pressure of the man he defended turning on him, he still refuses to close his eyes. Yuji enters the domain expansion for the second time, and this time is accused of the mass murder in Shibuya, basically the Shibuya incident, and he pleads guilty. This grants Higuruma the Executioner's Sword, a weapon that can kill Itadori in just one hit, but even now, he still can't turn away from the truth and just execute an innocent man. He knows that Sukuna was the one that caused the Shibuya incident and cannot punish Yuji for it, and this perfectly encapsulates who Higuruma is. He tries to convince himself that he hates humans and their flaws, but it simply isn't true, and Yuji's confession reminds him of his true feelings and how much he actually cherishes the weaknesses humans possess. What's just as interesting though is Yuji's confession itself. It really reinforces the level of guilt he feels for Sukuna's actions, and this is further displayed when Higuruma asks him why he would take responsibility, and Yuji responds by telling him it's his own fault for being weak. And with that, the encounter ends, and I can honestly say it's one of my favorite interactions in the show so far. Higuruma has immediately landed in the favorite characters bracket for me, so I hope we can see a little more from him. But anyway, Megumi, who was also actually looking for Higuruma, was tricked and engages in a fight with Reggie before beating him and taking his points too. His intelligence is shown yet again here as he uses a building to negate his lack of ability to place a barrier around his domain, and it works to perfection. I also want to talk about something else I like about Megumi, his ability to kill when required. It helps a lot when someone so close to Yuji is not against killing when necessary, as I can imagine a lot of situations that could come about from sparing a bad person. This also reminds me of the question Megumi asks to Yuji at the beginning of the show, where he basically reminds him that someone he saves can kill someone else in the future, implying that sometimes people have to die to save the many, which is ironically the way Itadori thinks of himself too after Shibuya. He is unsure as to whether or not he should die to save the many people that Sukuna might kill in the future, and so quite ironically, Megumi's logic to kill others is really similar to Yuji's, who wouldn't ever kill. The only difference is that Yuji only applies the logic to harming himself, while Megumi has no such discretion. We also find Angel as she suddenly descends on a collapsed Megumi, so I guess we are on our way to Gojo being unsealed? But I do think there will be a twist because it was just way too easy to find her. Before I move on to the next major event, I want to talk about Takaba. This guy seems ridiculously overpowered right now with his cartoonish curse technique. It seems like anything he can imagine becomes reality, but I'm sure there has to be some sort of limit, right? I mean, does it use curse energy? Is there some sort of condition? Or is it really just one of the strongest powers in the universe? I guess we'll find out later, but we move on to Yuta's perspective as he attempts to defeat the 4 elite players in the Sendai colony one by one. He succeeds easily with the first, taking Durov out in one shot before defeating this cockroach player with one of the craziest moves I've ever seen. Not necessarily because of how destructive it was, but because he literally kissed a cockroach. I mean, I guess sometimes you have to do what's necessary to win, but that's not usually what I think of when I think of that statement. But anyways, we move on to a 3-way fight with Ura, Ryu and Yuta, who now has the help of Rika and is in a state where he is much more powerful. And after a really cool panel that depicts a 3-way domain expansion, Ryu takes out Ura, turning it into a 1v1, or I guess a 2v1 that Yuta eventually wins. I loved this fight, and more specifically the part of the fight where Yuta clashes with Ryu's beam directly instead of defeating him in an easier way, and he copies Ura's technique to get the win, revealing his curse technique, the ability to copy others. Ryu's character is really cool in general, and even though I'm sure we will probably never see him again, I still thought he was a cool character for the time he was in the story. Yuta though has probably achieved one of the biggest feats in the show so far, defeating 4 elite sorcerers, of which at least 1 or two look like special grades, but obviously we are completely unsure of their strength. However, Ryu's cursed energy output is definitely one of the highest we have seen in the entire show so far, so that should tell us something. Regardless, this 5-way fight pretty much confirmed to me that Yuta is probably the strongest sorcerer remaining after Gojo has been sealed. But it's finally time to see the man I've been desperately waiting to see fight all out for a while now, Kenji Hakari, and after all of the hype from a number of different characters, he finally showcases his ridiculously strong and confusing abilities. I'm gonna be honest, I didn't even bother to understand his domain expansion. I've pretty much dumbed it down in my brain to, if Hakari gets a jackpot, it means Hakari gets unlimited cursed energy and reverse curse techniques so fast it practically means immortality. And if he doesn't, then he simply doesn't get all of those features that I was just talking about now. All the other stuff really don't make sense to me, but it doesn't matter or affect my enjoyment of his fighting, to be honest. And we see Hakari being pushed to the limit even more in his fight with Kashimo, the sorcerer who had just destroyed Panda, and this is a fight that Hakari wins, and one of the best fights in the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen so far. And when I say one of the best fights, I mean both in the anime and the manga. I never thought that a fight that I read in the manga would be able to hold a candle to the beautiful animation that I've seen in the anime, but I was wrong. The clash of wild personalities and insane abilities between Kashimo and Hakari make for such an exciting high-tempo match. Kashimo's desire to defeat Hakari during his immortality only serves to raise the pace, as both men feel like they are on a timer. Hakari's domain is way more overpowered than I thought too. It really feels like the low percentage of him hitting jackpot just isn't real, and he can instead hit it whenever he wants. Maybe it has something to do with the same way that he rigs fights in his Fight Club being translated into his domain expansion. There is one point where Kashimo fatally wounds Hakari the moment his time limit ends, and he simply hits the jackpot again and heals. I guess his words in his earlier fight where he claims that he isn't just relying on luck were true, and Hakari ends up winning the fight by surviving an explosion that Kashimo caused using the last of his energy. Hakari survived by using a binding vow to lose his arm in return for the rest of his body, and he takes Kashimo's points, ending my favorite fight in the series so far. Binding vows are really interesting to me. I kind of thought that there was something that you kind of had to have a plan to use, but I guess you can activate it by simply thinking of one. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how exactly do you enter a binding vow with yourself? Is having the intention enough? And who decides if whatever you're willing to give up for the binding vow is actually valuable enough to grant whatever it is that you want? But anyways, one thing I know for sure is Gege really knows how to draw fights and make his characters interesting, as Hakari has fully lived up to the hype for me, and he calls into the question the statement I made earlier about Yuta being the strongest remaining sorcerer after Gojo's departure. It's definitely a lot more arguable now, and between his unbelievable domain and Yuta's massive cursed energy reserves, I couldn't really tell you who's stronger, although with Rika I would have to assume the answer to that would be Yuta. We then move on to another one of my favorite characters, Maki's perspective. Yeah, if you haven't noticed yet, there's a trend forming here. Maki, Hakari, Yuta, Higuruma, I love damn near everybody that's been getting some spotlight in this arc, so I think my opinion on this arc so far is pretty damn obvious. But anyways, just before we move on to Maki's fight, we get probably the single most disrespectful thing I've ever seen in a manga. Noritoshi returns to the Camel clan's house and finds Kenjaku there, who tells him he has taken over and will never see him again. Noritoshi obviously expects Kenjaku to kill him based on what he just said, but Kenjaku is shocked by the idea of Noritoshi thinking that he is even worth killing, and he tells him to just leave the house as he doesn't want to cause any mess. He literally sees as much threat in him as we would see a fly on the wall, and the fact he clearly isn't trying to go out of his way to be disrespectful and is genuinely just not bothered enough to kill him makes this interaction even more disrespectful. Kenjaku's arrogance is just unbelievable, but after this Noritoshi meets Maki and they end up getting in a fight with a curse, who actually turns out to be Naoya, who has so much hatred for Maki that he literally forced his way into reincarnation as a curse so he could hunt her down. You almost have to respect how much of a hater he is at this point. He literally rejects death itself to destroy Maki. He cannot stand the idea of this woman being as strong as Toji, and he develops new strength and overpowers Maki before two completely random people join the fight, and one of them, a sumo wrestler, takes Maki into his domain and teaches her how to be free, unlocking Maki's full potential in one of the coolest moments so far, and a human on par with Toji has finally been born. The idea of time being different within a domain is an interesting one that changes how I view domains quite a lot. We knew that space is completely different on the inside of a barrier, but knowing time is affected means that domains can be used in various ways I didn't see possible before. But I can only assume that such a strong ability is the trade-off for having such a simple domain that cannot actually hurt your opponent, like the sumo domain. Jujutsu Kaisen is a story based around equivalent exchange after all. The next big thing to happen doesn't occur in the Culling games but outside of it, as Kenjaku defeats Choso and Yuki before taking Tengen for himself. This little stretch has some great moments throughout, revealing things like Kenjaku's domain and power, and developing the characters of Yuki and Choso. Choso in particular finally explains his perspective and the reason for the route he took as a curse in an emotional moment that I love, and Kenjaku really went up in my estimations as a fighter in this arc. His creativity and complex moveset is really interesting to me, and he kind of embodies Geto's potential if he perhaps survived in JJK 0. But talking about great moments, none were greater than the one coming up. The team finally saves Sumiki, but she reveals herself to be an imposter named Yoruzu, and just as they are about to fight her, suddenly the words "end chain" can be heard, and Sukuna appears out of nowhere before switching with Megumi. My jaw was literally on the floor while reading this, and it took me a while to process before I was able to turn the page. Yuji's self-neglect seems to go further than we originally thought. In fact, it seems like he was this way before he was even a sorcerer. Itadori didn't include himself in the agreement with Sukuna made with him to take over his body without hurting anyone, and Sukuna uses this to rip his own finger off and shove it down Megumi's throat, allowing himself to transfer into him. And remember when I was talking about Kenjaku displaying Geto's full potential earlier? Well, Sukuna takes it to a whole new level as he demonstrates a superpowered version of Megumi's curse techniques, the 10 Shadows, destroying everyone around him before finding and killing Yoruzu, the sorcerer using Sumiki's body, and he kills Megumi's sister using only his techniques to sink his soul completely. Such a sad scene, but one where we see the full potential of Megumi's shadows. Mahoraga specifically is way stronger when actually under someone's control, and Sukuna uses him strategically to easily defeat Yoruzu, and it really seems like he chose the ideal person to turn into, which makes sense as we know in Shibuya Sukuna went out of his way to save Megumi, and now we know why. But we move on as it's finally time for the strongest to return, as everyone groups up to finally free Satoru Gojo from the prison realm, and the way he returns is nothing short of perfect. I know, okay, I said perfect, even though most people would want him to return in the heat of battle at a climactic point, but I actually really like the way Gege dealt with the return of the character, coming back and showing off almost immediately in the most Gojo way possible to end the arc. But I do wish we got some sort of arc between this one and the one coming up. I get that Gege wants to keep the pace of the show up, but I feel like with the amount of new great characters introduced, we could have used the time between Gojo being unsealed and the Sukuna fight as a chance to explore some of them. But we move straight on to the next portion of the story as Gojo prepares to take on Sukuna. I know I complained about a lack of an arc between the Culling games and the showdown between Gojo and Sukuna, but one good thing that did come out from these few chapters in between both arcs was the backslapping scene with Gojo to prepare him for his upcoming battle. This whole moment gave me this warm feeling that really reminded me of the old days of early Jujutsu Kaisen, where we would sometimes spend a full episode just getting to know the main trio as they hold on to the idea of leading somewhat regular lives while beginning their journey as sorcerers. In a way, it's actually kind of fitting that there was no real downtime between the Culling games and the big fight. Back then, when those type of episodes were more regular in Jujutsu Kaisen, the characters viewed themselves as humans with complex emotions, which would obviously need to be explored and understood. But as the story has progressed, that has changed massively to the point where they are now basically robots, forever carrying out their duties. Or as Itadori bluntly puts it, cogs in a machine that simply do what is required to protect humanity. A cog doesn't need a backstory or a few chapters fleshing out its characters or emotions, it simply exists to do its tasks, which is why it's pretty fitting to me that as the perception of sorcerers has changed from emotional humans to robotic cogs, Gege goes from spending time to explore the characters individually to skipping over this process completely. Also, the fact that the people of Japan are literally betting on the fight between Gojo and Sukuna is hilarious to me. Not only is it a funny idea in general, but what what do the people who are betting on Sukuna hope to gain? The man who will literally end life on Earth if he wins. I can just imagine a guy who bet for Sukuna to win out there celebrating as Sukuna kills Gojo, only for him to realize that he probably only has a few hours left to live. Also, from the perspective of Mei, who seems to be the one running this betting situation, how the hell would she actually gain money? The only way she could really make money is if people actually bet on Sukuna. If they bet on Gojo, then it's really a lose-lose situation for her, as I just explained. Either pay out everyone's bet or probably have the world end. But knowing Mei, she would probably choose the second option anyway. One more thing I want to mention before getting into the main fight though is the casual reveal that Yuji can swap bodies? I'm not gonna say too much about this now because I'm sure something this extreme will be explained in length later on, so let's just move on to the main event, Satoru Gojo vs Ryomen Sukuna, to determine the fate of the world. The fight starts off with a bang, quite literally, as Gojo sends a massive 120% strength Hello Purple Sukuna's way, and it's really the first time the effect of incantations has been explored in Jujutsu Kaisen. Everything in Jujutsu Kaisen so far has been centered around this concept of balance. To gain something, you must lose something in equal amount. This concept made complete sense to me, and it's been used in other shows in the past. In Fullmetal Alchemist, the first law of alchemy is to obtain something of equal value must be lost. In Hunter x Hunter, we see Kurapika exchange his ability to fight anyone outside of the Phantom Troop in return for broken abilities that could only be used on them. The point that I'm making is the equivalent exchange system that the Jujutsu Kaisen world is based on is not something that hasn't been done before, but I didn't realize how far it impacted day-to-day sorcery for these characters. We practically never hear incantations or see characters dancing to perform their moves, and this whole time that has actually been a required process to perform an action that sorcerers have just been skipping over by trading it for slightly weaker moves, and the fact that it hasn't been skipped over this time and instead leaned into reinforces the scale of the upcoming battle, and what a start to the fight it is. Some of the spreads in the earlier parts of the fight was just unbelievable. I mean, just look at this spread of the Hollow Purple. The action too was just non-stop pure jujutsu fighting for a few chapters before this first major turning point occurs as both fighters use domain expansion. I feel like this is where the fight's mood shifted from being an all-out brawl to becoming more of a chess match. Sukuna wins the first domain expansion battle due to the fact that he had no barrier and could extend his domain outside of the limits of Gojo's unlimited void, meaning he could attack it from the outside, where domains are much weaker, giving Sukuna the momentum in the fight as Gojo was unable to use his curse technique immediately after his domain expansion was destroyed, or at least we thought, because it seems nothing is impossible for the two that stand atop the Jujutsu Kaisen universe, as Gojo debuts a whole new concept, using reverse curse technique to actually heal his curse technique. Yet this is starting to feel like a competition to see who can pull the most ridiculous move out of the bag, as both fighters who have been undisputed as the strongest in their own eras push each other to new limits. Also, a side note, but since when did Kupusabi become the most knowledgeable guy in the whole world? I mean, I get being smart, but this guy is on a whole different level of intellect. He seems to immediately understand and explain literally everything that happens in the match, and to be honest, with the survival instincts he showed in Shibuya, I'm not surprised that he's practically a genius. Getting back to the fight though, Gojo breaks the limits of the world yet again by expanding a domain before making it ridiculously tiny, changing the conditions of his domain on the fly as if the restrictions were never there in the first place. At this point, I think it's fair to say that these two monsters can bend the rules to whatever they desire. Gege is clearly telling us that the rules that apply to others simply don't with these guys. Obviously, Sukuna is able to match this and both domains are destroyed simultaneously, and this domain battle happens again 2 times before Gojo is finally able to expand his domain a few seconds before Sukuna, catching him in his infinite void, and while the fight looks like it has finally swung in Gojo's favor, Sukuna suddenly swaps with Mahoraga, who has somehow already adapted to infinite void. We find out that the reason Mahoraga had already adapted was because Megumi's soul was the one taking the damage required for Mahoraga's adaptation to activate. The amount Megumi has gone through in such a short amount of time is just ridiculous. It always felt like Megumi was a pretty unfortunate person in general. You can tell just from his demeanor and mindset that he has experienced the harsh realities of being a sorcerer at full force. But this is another level entirely. Within the span of 20 chapters, his sister that he worked so hard to save from the Culling games ended up being an imposter in historic times. Sukuna has taken over his body as a host. His own body and techniques were used to kill his sister while he watched, completely powerless to do anything. And now, to top it all off, his soul is being directly damaged by his own teacher's attacks. In every scenario, it seems like the worst possible outcome is attracted to him every single time. However, Gojo remains confident and uses his domain expansion again, only to dramatically fail in doing so, prompting an explanation from Sukuna on how he was able to damage the part of his brain responsible for cursed energy and use reverse curse technique to heal it, thus refreshing his curse technique. Sukuna laughs as he tells him he has reached his limit and gives him a long speech about how weak he is before attempting to use his own domain expansion and realizing he has embarrassingly reached his limit too. It finally feels like we are entering the end game of the fight and the end of these two's unlimited abilities. Sukuna basically sets a timer for Mahoraga to adapt to Gojo's limitless, basically setting a timer for the end of the fight. Because of Gojo's ability, Mahoraga cannot adapt after one hit or one turn as he normally does, and it is determined that he requires 4 spins to fully adapt and cut through Gojo's limitless. So in other words, Gojo has the time that it takes for the wheel to spin 4 times to beat Sukuna, and he definitely takes his chance with both hands, taking the advantage and even landing a black flash before Sukuna switches with Mahoraga again. The fight turns into a 3v1 as Sukuna teams up with an adapted to limitless version of Mahoraga and the rest of the 10 shadows fused into a fusion beast called Agito, and for the first time everyone watching actually considers the idea of Gojo losing and potentially being killed. Everything he has tried so far hasn't worked, and now with Mahoraga's adaptation, it seems like he is on the ropes, and Gojo thinks back to the last time he felt this way, that fated day when he faced Toji Zenin. And just like that day, it's these moments where Gojo feels like his life is truly on the line that he shines the most and exceeds his own impossibly high limits, as even after Mahoraga takes his arm, he manages to use blue to defeat Agito and thinks up a plan on the spot to fire a red to combine with the earlier blue, making a massive hollow purple which defeats Mahoraga and severely wounds Sukuna. Finally, Gojo has won. The first thing that I felt when I read the next chapter depicting some sort of flashback for Gojo was confusion. To be honest, I couldn't wrap my head around what I was reading and was in a bit of denial about whether or not what I had just read had actually happened. Why was Gojo talking to Geto when we just had been informed of his victory? And then I scrolled down further to see Gojo's dead body, and even at this point I genuinely still believed he was alive. It seemed like it was a fake out. Gojo was just severely injured. After all, a face with blood coming out the mouth is not necessarily proof that someone has died. But then I kept scrolling. And yeah, I get the message. Gojo is 100% dead. In this world where people are able to come back from almost anything due to reverse curse technique, Gege has clearly made a stand here, a statement that Gojo is gone for good by brutally killing him in a way that would be impossible to come back from, and I probably should have expected. After all, Sukuna is definitely the final antagonist in the show, and unless Gege plans to leave a lot of situations unresolved, it wouldn't really make too much sense for Gojo to actually win this fight. Obviously, it's really easy to say this in hindsight, but I was shocked for quite a while after reading the chapter. To kill off by far the most popular character in your series while absolutely closing the door on any potential return is a very bold move by Gege, and it has opened the door for a great finale to the series where I see a lot of different characters potentially shining. It would have been interesting to have seen the fight in Sukuna's original body without any outside influences like the 10 shadows, but I'm happy the fight happened in the way that it did. Megumi's technique and body being used in this fight added a whole extra layer that made the fight that much more important. Anyways, as shocking and as crazy as this ending was, the entire fight itself was amazing as Sukuna was truly pushed to his limits, and this fact is highlighted by the final line in this legendary brawl. "You did well, Satoru Gojo. I won't forget you for as long as I live." Jujutsu Kaisen, what a journey. The depths that this story has reached and the level of investment that it has brought out of me is something that I would have never predicted after I watched season 1. From a show with constant action that I kind of watched with my brain turned off to one of the most addicting manga I've ever read. This is the definition of subverting and exceeding my expectations. I became so invested that I spent a ridiculous amount of time on my laptop editing this very video just so that I can get my thoughts out there on this amazing show. And to be honest, I'm really happy with the way this turned out. And after all the effort I put in, something that doesn't take any effort is leaving a like on this video and subscribing for more content like this in the future. From the characters, storyline, fighting and emotions, I couldn't be happier that I finally gave the Jujutsu Kaisen manga a chance.